Night settles over a Lynn County field where straw stacks stand like castles, and the road carries the creak of a wagon. In May of 1894, the Meeks family stepped into that dark and vanished. At dawn, a child staggered home, Nellie Meeks, wounded and whispering a song of murder. Who led them out, and why was she spared? Welcome to the Ozark Archive. Tell us where you are watching and when. Share your Ozark ties below, and if these shadows matter to you, subscribe and walk with me again. In the spring of 1894, the country up around Browning and Milan was still a place where the land set the rules, and the people learned to bend with them. North Missouri is not the Ozarks by ridge and stone, but it is kin to the Ozarks by temperament. The same long conservations on porches, the same thrift born of hard winters, the same old habit of watching a stranger a second longer than polite. You could ride for a mile and not see a house, then come on one tucked back in walnut shade, smoke curling out of the chimney, a strip of garden turned black and neat beside the door. Folks here measured wealth in hogs and corn, in a milk cow that lived another year, in a field that did not wash out when the rains came. Every family, rich or poor, lived close to the edge of what a bad season could take away. The decade was uneasy in ways the newspapers only half said out loud. The railroads had come, yes, and with them a quicker path to market, but also a quicker path to trouble. To men who once stayed within a few counties, all their lives might now vanish south on a freight car before dawn. A court and county seat towns could look imposing to an outsider, but to most farmers, it felt like a far-off thing, a place you visited only if tragedy or debt drove you there. Law was real, but it was not always near. If a horse went missing or a barn door was found kicked in, you did not wait for a deputy to ride out 2 days later. You rode to your neighbor first. You asked questions by lamplight. You listened for who had been drinking too hard, who had been seen on the road late, who had quarreled with who. In that sort of world, trust was a kind of currency, and suspicion was the shadow that spent just as easy. There had been cattle trouble on these border farms for years. A thin cow could mean the difference between making it and not. A stolen steer was not just theft, it was hunger stealing tomorrow from your children. So when a man was known to be light-fingered with livestock, his name spread fast. People might still trade with him, they might shake his hand at church, but they watched their pastures a little closer after he passed. The Taylor brothers, Bill and George, were spoken of in that way, in the low voice people use when they are not sure whether talk alone might summon more danger. Later papers would say they were suspected cattle thieves and already under pressure from the law, and that pressure is part of what turned this story into blood. It was also a time when the old Ozark border habit of making songs out of sorrow was still alive and well. The mountains do not waste grief, they shape it. They turn it into warning, into memory you can carry in your mouth. A man might be plowing in a field and sing about a drowning 30 years past, not because he enjoyed the pain of it, but because in hard country the dead do not stay quiet unless you give them a place to settle. Ballads were newspapers for people who could not read well, and they were prayers for people who had no other way to speak about what frightened them. That is why a murder that happened up in Lynn County could slide down through southern Missouri and into the hills like a cold draft under a door. The killers ran that way after the deed, and the story ran with them. The Meeks family lived in this world as plain folk, not saints, not strangers to hardship, but steady people by all accounts. Gus Meeks worked. His wife Delora kept house and children, and together they made the kind of life that rarely gets written down until something rips it apart. They were not famous. They were not powerful. They were the sort of family you passed on the road and nodded to. Folks who might lend a tool, swap a bit of seed corn, and then go home to their own supper. That ordinariness is part of why what happened next cuts so deep. In rural country, you accept that storms come and fevers come. But when cruelty comes wearing a familiar face, it does something else to you. It rots the notion of safety from the inside. In those days, children learned early what the land could do and what men could do. They gathered eggs, fetched water, minded younger ones, and listened with half an ear when grown-ups spoke too soft. They heard the small quarrels that never left the kitchen. They heard the bigger ones that traveled from farm to farm like a bad wind. There is a line between childhood and adulthood that feels thin in country life, because children are always close enough to see that the world is not gentle. Still, they expect their own home to be a shelter, even if it is a poor one. That expectation is what makes a family tragedy more than private grief. It feels like the breaking of an old promise. As spring warmed the soil in May, the fields around Browning and Jenkins Cemetery were turning green and ready. Corn rows were being planted. Straw from last year lay stacked in the corners of fields, waiting to be used or hauled off. The nights were mild enough to sit outside and listen to whippoorwills. The roads were dusty by day and dark as ink by night. If you stepped off the track into the timber after sundown, you could lose yourself in 10 yards. That kind of darkness does not just hide a man. It swallows sound. It folds secrets in on themselves. People who grew up there knew which hollows carried voices and which ones did not. They knew where a lantern could be seen from far off and where it could not. It was a landscape that could make a good person feel alone and a bad person feel safe. When news later called the Meeks killings one of the most notorious crimes in Missouri history, it was not only because of the violence. It was because of the way the violence seemed to rise right out of everyday life, out of the small economy of trust and debt and fear that people lived in without much choice. The old folks around there would say the country was quiet before that night, quiet in the way a pond is quiet before a stone is thrown. Some would say they had a feeling. Some would say they did not. Memory makes prophets of us all after the fact. But what every account agrees on is that by mid-May, the Meeks family had become tangled in the Taylor brothers' troubles, and that a decision was made in the dark that could not be undone. So as we start this journey together, I want you to hold two pictures in your mind. One is of a farm country that looks gentle from a distance, sun on grass, children in a yard, smoke from a cook stove. The other is of the same place after midnight, the road empty but for tracks you cannot see, a straw stack standing out in a field like a lonesome monument, and the feeling that something is moving through the dark toward a house that does not know it has been chosen. How does a quiet life come to such an end? And when a child survives to tell it, what happens to the story after it leaves her mouth and enters the hills? Somewhere down that road, in the soft night air of May, a wagon was already rolling. The wheels turned slow, and the sound of them was swallowed by the trees, as if the land itself wanted to keep what was about to happen from being heard too soon. The wagon wheels you could not hear back there in the timber were not carrying strangers. They were coming for a family that had already packed its hopes into quilts and feather ticks and small bundles, the way poor people do when they think they are starting over. Gus Meeks was not a man of headlines. He was a farmer and a hired hand when hired hands were needed, living near Milan in Sullivan County but tied by kin and worked to the farms around Browning. Neighbors later remembered him as steady and plain-spoken, the kind who paid what he could, kept his word when he gave it, and saved his temper for work rather than talk. He had a wife, Delora, and 3 girls, Hattie and Mary still little enough to be carried when they got tired, and Nellie old enough to help mind the younger ones. In a country where most people owned little besides their labor, that family was Gus's fortune. If you want to understand how a crime like this could happen, you have to sit a while with their ordinary days. In the 1890s, a farm family's calendar was not marked by leisure, but by chores that never let up. Spring meant breaking ground, patching harness, planting corn and potatoes, and praying for steady rain with no late frost. Summer was haying, weeding, and fixing what broke in heat and hard use. Fall meant gathering, slaughtering, and stacking by what might carry you through winter. Then winter itself, long and strict, when the wind found every crack in a cabin wall and a pot had to be made to last because the road to town might be drifted shut. In that life, there was little room for grand ambition. You hoped for health, for decent crops, for a horse that would not go lame, for a neighbor who would lend a hand if your barn roof went down. You hoped your children would grow into something a shade easier than what you had known. Delora Meeks kept that circle alive. The records do not tell us her thoughts, but they do tell us what her life required. A mother in those years rose before light, cooked, washed, tended a garden, and watched children who were always within a few steps of a stove or a pond or a nervous horse. She knew every seam in the girls' clothes and every way to stretch a pot of beans. She also knew the social map of the neighborhood. She knew which doors were safe to knock on in need, which men drank too hard to be trusted, which families carried old grudges, and which ones would show up silent and steady if tragedy ever came. The girls learned the same map without being taught. Children do that. They absorb the weather of grown-ups even when no one speaks it out loud. That quiet life, for all its steadiness, had already been touched by trouble. After the murders, newspapers reported that Gus had once been indicted in a bank draft forgery case, along with William Taylor, and had served time before being pardoned so the state could use him as a chief witness against the Taylor brothers. It is not a flattering detail, and for that very reason, it deserves honesty. Folks in hard country are rarely carved from clean wood. A man can fall in with the wrong crowd, make a poor choice, and spend the rest of his days trying to live it down. We cannot know whether Gus felt shame, fear, or simple resolve when the governor's pardon set him loose again. But the papers agree on the next part. He was expected to testify against the Taylors, and the Taylors knew it. They tried several paths to remove that threat. Accounts in local papers said they first threatened Gus, then tried to buy his silence. They offered money and a wagon and team if he would leave the area before court convened. In that day, $800 or $1,000 was more cash than most farmers saw at one time. A wagon and team were not mere convenience. They were a new life and a way to carry it. If you were scratching by and someone offered you the means to cross a state line and start fresh, it was a temptation that could feel like mercy. Yet mercy coming from violent men has a bite hidden underneath. When Gus listened, he was choosing between two kinds of danger. The danger of standing in court against men he knew to be desperate, and the danger of trusting them for one long night on a lonely road. So there came a night when the Meeks household did what people do when they think they are leaving for good. They packed. Not fine furniture, for there was none, but what could be hauled and what mattered. Clothes rolled tight, bedding, a few kitchen things, perhaps a sack of meal and dried fruit for the road, a feather tick to throw on the wagon bed so the children could lie down. Witnesses later said Gus's mother knew of the plan and even saw the Taylors at the house, which tells you this was not a sudden snatching from sleep. It was the kind of leaving where a family has time to hope. Somewhere in all that packing, there must have been small gestures no reporter ever wrote down. Delora smoothing a child's hair, tying a ribbon, straightening a collar in the way mothers do even when time is short. Nellie stepping around her sisters, feeling that strange excitement children feel when grown-ups are doing something hurried after dark. Gus trying to keep his voice steady because fathers believe their steadiness can hold the world together. Maybe he promised the girls a better place. Maybe he said it would be an adventure just for a little while. Maybe he did not speak much at all, because sometimes a man who is afraid talks less, not more. Whatever words were said in that lamplight never reached the printed record. Only the fact of the packing did. The Taylor brothers arrived late and were seen traveling quickly toward Milan in a wagon, witnesses said. It was not yet midnight when the Meeks climbed aboard with their bundles. That detail carries a thin, cruel irony. Midnight is the hour of superstition, but the work of violence usually starts earlier, while families are still awake enough to trust. The wagon turned south toward Lynn County, toward the country around Jenkins Cemetery and George Taylor's farm. The road was dusty in daylight and blind in darkness. Trees leaned in on both sides, Every creek crossing sounded bigger at night. Every rustle in brush could be a rabbit or a man. Later, when the story was sung and resung, people sometimes treated the Meeks family like characters in a moral tale. Gus becomes either a fool for trusting criminals or a hero for refusing to be their pawn, depending on who is telling it. Delora becomes a saintly mother. The children become symbols of innocence taken as tribute to evil. That is how folk memory works. It makes shapes we can carry. But the Meeks family were not symbols in their own lives. They were a man and woman trying to keep their girls safe in a hard season, and 3 children who believed the grown-ups knew the way. As the wagon rolled on into Lynn County, there would have been a moment when the last lamp glow of home fell behind them. After that, there was only the dark ahead and the low sound of wheels turning toward a field none of them had ever seen. By the time that wagon crossed into Lynn County, the road itself felt like a boundary between what a family believes and what a family learns too late. We know this much from the papers and from testimony that survived in print. Gus Meeks had been a problem to the Taylor brothers, not because he was rich or powerful, but because he was expected to stand in court and speak plain against them. In a lawless corner of farm country, a witness can be more dangerous to a criminal than any sheriff. A man can outrun a posse, hole up in the hills, bribe a juror, talk his way through a hearing, but he cannot unhear a neighbor's voice naming him under oath. The Taylors understood that, and whether they wore their threat openly or hid it behind false kindness, they were already moving in a world where the narrowest path led back to violence. William and George Taylor were not strangers to rumor even before the Meeks family rode with them that night. Newspapers called them cattle thieves and desperados, and those words were not thrown around lightly in the 1890s. Yet it is worth remembering that in a rural county, a reputation is a living thing. It grows, it twists, it drifts across fences on the same wind that carries gossip. One man's thief is another man's hard case who got in with the wrong lot. One woman's devil is another woman's boy I knew when he was small. We should not soften what they were accused of, but neither should we pretend our distance makes us wiser than the people who had to live near them. The record suggests that Bill Taylor, especially, had been deep in criminal trouble. He had faced charges alongside Gus in a forgery case, and the state had leaned on Gus afterward, offering a pardon in exchange for testimony. That arrangement puts a man like Gus in a dangerous middle. To the state, he becomes useful. To his former partners, he becomes a traitor. In the Ozark border country, where pride and loyalty can be as binding as law, a witness is often treated like someone who has broken kinship itself. Even if Gus had been right to cooperate, he was now marked. Some accounts say the Taylors swore they would kill him rather than go to prison again. Whether that was said once in a rage or repeated over time, the point is the same. They had already framed the future as a fight for their own survival. And men who see the world that way will bargain, threaten, and lie with equal ease. The offer of money and a fresh wagon was not generosity. It was strategy dressed up as rescue. It was a way to get Gus where they needed him, someplace beyond the eyes of neighbors, beyond the reach of daylight. If you listen to the ballads that later rose from this crime, you hear the Taylor brothers turned into almost mythic villains. They are often described as cold-blooded hunters who walk the night like wolves. The songs need them that way. A ballad is a moral compass as much as a story. It takes a raw event and shapes it into a warning you can hum while you work. But the historical picture is more complicated. The Taylors were men of this same countryside. They knew its roads and creeks and fence lines because they belonged to them just as surely as the Meeks did. They were not a foreign evil drifting in. They were a homegrown danger, and that is always the most frightening kind. A community can guard against outsiders. It has a harder time guarding against its own sons. There is another layer to the tension, one that Ozark people understand without being told. When a man is tied to law trouble, the trouble leaks into everyone around him. It leaks into his mother's kitchen, into his brother's barns, into the friendships that once felt safe. When folks say the Taylors were desperate, they do not mean merely that they were wanted. They mean that the net had tightened so far that only a cruel move remained. Accounts in the Missouri press point to the idea that their plan was not original murder, but a forced removal of a witness, maybe a kidnapping that turned into execution once they felt cornered. You can hear that possibility in the way the crime unfolded, with deception first and then violence when the deception had done its work. Still, I want to pause here with the big question that hangs over any old case like this. How much of what we believe about the Taylors comes from solid record, and how much comes from a community trying to make sense of a wound? The newspapers of the day were quick to name suspects, and in this case, they seem to have named them well. Yet papers also lean toward drama. They labeled men as monsters because monster is a word that sells copies and calms fear. If evil is monstrous, it is easier to fence off. If evil is human, it is harder to live with. Local memory carried extra rumors too. Some later storytellers hinted at other hands in the crime, maybe friends, maybe kin, maybe someone who helped drive the wagon or stand watch. These stories have never been proven, and we should not pretend they were, but their existence tells us what the countryside felt in the years after. People were not only grieving, they were wary. They wondered if the killers had moved alone or with a small network behind them, because that is what criminal life often looked like in sparsely policed regions. You did not survive long as a thief without somebody feeding you news and a bed now and again. A rumor about accomplices is a community's way of admitting it felt vulnerable and perhaps complicit without wanting to be. Even the road south into the Ozarks carries an almost legendary weight in the retellings. After the murders, the brothers headed that direction, and the hills became a stage for the chase. When criminals flee toward the mountains, people imagine the mountains as sheltering them. The land becomes part of the villainy, even though the land is innocent. Ozark country has always been a refuge for the hunted, sometimes for the righteous and often for the wicked, because its folds and hollows can hide a man with a price on him better than any city alley. But all of that is still ahead. On the night we are walking through now, none of those later judgments existed yet. The Taylor brothers were still just two figures on a wagon bench, guiding a family down a dark road. Gus Meeks sat somewhere behind them. Delora held the children close. The girls likely dozed, heads bumping softly against bedding with each rut in the track. The air was mild and the whippoorwills kept calling. There was no reason yet for a child to think the world could turn in an instant. If the Taylors spoke, we do not know what they said. Maybe they talked of the place Gus could go, of work to be found elsewhere, of how trouble would be behind him by morning. Maybe they said little, letting the quiet of the road do the soothing. Men planning harm often know how to sound calm. They know how to borrow the language of friendship to lower a guard. The most chilling thing about this story is not that violence happened. It is that violence rode beside trust for mile after mile, close enough to feel like safety, until the road itself ran out. Somewhere near Jenkins Cemetery, where fields opened wider and straw stacks rose like pale mounds in the moonlight, the wagon began to slow. The night had grown thicker, and a coldness came up from the ground, the kind you feel in your bones even when the air is not yet sharp. The family had traveled far enough now that no neighbor's lantern could be seen, no dog's bark could be recognized. Only the hush of open country lay around them, and in that hush, the next choice was made. The wagon slowing in those fields was not a small thing. A farm road at night does not invite stopping unless there is a gate to open, a creek to cross, or a purpose waiting in the dark. Later accounts place the scene near Jenkins Cemetery, close to the Taylor place, with straw stacks standing in a harvested field like pale hills under moonlight. Straw stacks were common then, gathered from threshing and piled high to keep dry. To a traveler, they were just part of the farm landscape. To someone planning harm, they were shelter, hiding and grave all at once. The fact that the bodies were later found concealed in such a stack tells you something about forethought. This was not the chaos of a sudden quarrel on the road. This was a place chosen because it offered cover. We have to be careful as we step into this stretch of the story, because the line between what is proven and what is guessed grows thin here. The newspapers of 1894 and 1895, along with testimony at the inquests and trials, give the main contours. But the exact words said in that field, the exact sequence of every movement, those things belong to the dead and to the single child who lived. Some later storytellers filled the gaps with imagination. Some ballads shaped the scene to fit their rhyme. Our job is to stay with what history allows and to leave silence where history goes quiet. What seems clear is that the Meeks family were led or guided from the wagon into the field. The reports suggest they had not yet understood the danger. If they had, there might have been a struggle on the road, a shout that could carry to a farmhouse, a chance for a horse to bolt. Instead, the violence happened out where no one could hear. That fits with the earlier deception about a safe journey south. It is a cruel pattern, old as betrayal itself. First you gain a man's trust, then you move him to a quiet spot, then you do what you came to do. Why bring the whole family? That question has haunted this case since the first day it was printed. If the aim was only to silence Gus, then Delora and the girls were not obstacles to the Taylor brothers' survival. They were witnesses. Yes, but witnesses who could have been left behind if the men had chosen a different path. The choice to kill them all suggests a turn into pure fear or pure malice, or both. Some papers argued that once the Taylors decided Gus had to die, they could not risk leaving anyone who might identify them as the men who took him. Others hinted at a colder motive, that cruelty grew by its own momentum once it was unleashed. We cannot climb inside the killers' heads. We can only say that in that field they crossed a line that even desperate men often hesitate before crossing. They chose to erase not only a witness, but a household. The weapon most accounts mention was a club, not a gun. That detail matters. A gunshot is quick and can be done at a distance. A club is intimate. It requires close range, repeated blows, and time enough to see what you are doing. When a murder is done that way, it carries a weight that lingers in the mind. It implies either a need for silence or a grim willingness to face the victims up close. In a farming region where guns were common, the choice of a blunt weapon to kill a family at midnight tells you the killers were thinking about the nearest houses, about dogs that might bark, about lanterns that might flare if a shot cracked the night. The parents were struck down first, as far as the record indicates. In a family attack like this, that is usually done to remove defense, to break the spine of resistance. Delora fell beside Gus, and after that, the little ones were helpless. Hattie and Mary were killed there too, children taken in the same terrible sweep as their parents. Newspapers did not shy away from describing their ages, because to readers in 1894, that fact carried the deepest horror. A community might understand a killing between grown men. It could not understand the killing of children who had no quarrel with anyone. That is why the story spread so fast and why it stayed. Nellie survived, but not unscarred. She was attacked, beaten, and left in the field, believed dead. Some versions of the tale add assault beyond beating. Historical sources are cautious, and we should be too. The papers say she was robbed of her small jewelry, wounded badly and abandoned. If worse happened, it is not for us to insist on it without proof. Still, even the proven injuries were enough to nearly kill her. That a child could be treated that way and yet live belongs to that stubborn Ozark and borderland kind of endurance that does not yield even when it should. One thing that does seem to come through both record and ballad is the eerie stillness after the violence. The killers did not flee in a wild rush. They had time to drag bodies, to conceal them, to pull straw over them until the field looked ordinary again. That act of hiding is not only practical, it is psychological. It is a man trying to deny the sight of what he has done, even while he knows it cannot be undone. The straw stack became a false hill, a quiet lid over a crime that would not stay buried very long. Imagine the field then. No lantern, no witness besides a bleeding child, the air full of May insects and the smell of crushed grass. Stars above, indifferent. Somewhere close by, a horse shifting its weight, harness creaking soft, the men finishing their work in dark silence. This is the moment where folklore later steps in and tries to add meaning. Some storytellers say a whippoorwill cried out like a warning, or that the moon hid its face, or that an owl watched as if it knew. Those are human ways of telling ourselves the world noticed, that nature itself recoiled. The truth is harder. Nature does not recoil. It keeps breathing. It keeps growing. It does not stop a man's hand. When the Taylors finally left, they took the wagon, and they took whatever money or goods they could find, leaving Nellie behind because they believed the field had finished her. Their wheels rolled away into the same dark they had used to come. The straw settled. The night went on. And in the hush where a whole family had been speaking only hours earlier, a single child lay among the shadows, listening to the men fade into distance and to the field return to its ordinary sounds. Above her, the straw stack rose like a pale mound against the sky, and the faint creak of wagon wheels drifted off toward the south, growing smaller until even that last thread of sound was swallowed by the dark. When the men were gone and the creak of the wagon had softened into distance, the field did what fields always do. It settled. Straw slid into new shapes. Dew began to gather. The night air cooled toward dawn. If you had been standing at a fence line then, you might have thought nothing had happened there at all. That is a hard Ozark border truth. The land is patient. It will take your labor and your blood the same way, and by morning it looks ready for another day. Nellie Meeks lay where she had fallen, a small body among the bodies of her parents and sisters. The newspapers said she had been struck in the head with a rock and left for dead. She was 6 years old. Somewhere in the black hours after the blows, life refused to let go. She drifted back toward waking in pieces, as if she were swimming up from deep water. First came sensation, the cold of ground seeping through torn clothes, the scratch of straw against her skin, the taste of iron in her mouth, the slow, fierce ache in her skull that made the world tilt. She opened her eyes into a grayness that did not yet separate shapes. Then slowly the shapes formed, and the truth of them began to register. She would have turned her head and found her mother not moving. She would have seen her little sisters, too still to be asleep. She would have felt the absence of her father's voice. No child is made to understand that picture, but children do understand danger. Their bodies know before their minds can name it. Terror rose in her, but so did a simpler, deeper thing. She was alive. That meant she could move. That meant she might find help. The killers had counted on silence. They had missed the stubbornness of a child who did not yet know how to surrender. She crawled at first, then pushed herself up. Every step would have sent fire through her skull. Blood ran down into her eyes. The ground tilted, yet she kept going, out from under the straw stack that hid her family and toward the road. The distance to the nearest house was not far by map, but for a wounded child in shock, it was a whole world. Dawn was coming in slow, pale layers, making the fields look harmless again. That contrast is part of what people later remembered most. The ordinary beauty of morning laid over a place of slaughter, as if the sky did not know what had happened in the dark. Nellie walked through that quiet like something half-formed, a living thing moving among dead ones, guided by instinct more than thought. The house she reached belonged to neighbors named Carter, according to later reports. Mrs. John Carter opened her door to a sight that would have stopped any mother cold. A little girl with clothes torn bloody, dirt ground into her skin, a deep gash across her forehead, standing there as if she had walked out of the grave. Nellie could hardly speak. She told the woman that her parents and baby sisters had been killed in the night. She said 2 men had done it. She said they had taken the family away in a wagon and stopped in the fields near Jenkins Cemetery. Her words came out broken, but the meaning was plain enough to chill the marrow. That is the moment when private horror became public fact. Somebody wrapped Nellie in a quilt. Somebody sent a boy running for help. A horse was saddled. In a country neighborhood, news moves like wildfire on dry grass. Men came with lanterns, though the sun was already over the tree line, because lanterns are what you carry into places your eyes do not want to go. They followed Nellie back across the road and into the field near Jenkins Cemetery. There they found the straw stack, hollowed and trampled, and when they pulled it apart, they found the bodies inside or beneath it, hidden as if straw could erase what had been done. Some accounts said the killings happened in a freshly planted cornfield, as though new growth might cover the crime before anyone noticed. But when death lies close to home, it does not stay covered long. The coroner was called. An inquest was held within days, and Nellie, still bandaged and pale, was asked to tell her story again. Imagine the weight of that on a child's shoulders. A room full of grown men, faces tight with grief and anger, waiting on her words to give their fury a direction. She described the men who took them. She spoke of the wagon, the ride, the stopping place. Her descriptions fit the Taylor brothers, whom many already suspected. An indictment soon followed. A 6-year-old voice became the hinge on which the whole case would turn. While the law began to stir, the community moved on older instincts. Grief spread house to house like a low fog. Relatives arrived, then neighbors, then people who barely knew the Meeks, but felt the wound as their own. Some wept, some went silent. Some stood in the yard with jaws clenched, already talking about posses and tracks. In farm country, mourning and mobilizing happened side by side. The men who helped lift bodies from straw were the same ones who knelt to study footprints and wagon ruts. The women who wiped blood from children's faces were the same ones who whispered prayers that justice would be swift. There is no contradiction in that. When evil touches a small place, people cling tighter to each other and also reach for the means to stop it from returning. Nellie was carried away from the field, but she did not leave it behind inside herself. She had crossed a border no child should cross. The world had shown her its darkest face and then demanded she describe it to adults who could barely bear to hear. In the weeks to come, her small testimony would become the spine of the case, and later the spine of the songs that traveled through Missouri and down into the Ozarks. The hills and prairies both have long memories for children who survive what families do not, because a survivor is proof that the story is not finished. By nightfall, newspapers were sharpening their headlines, calling it the Midnight Massacre and one of the most brutal murders in the annals of 2 counties. Yet all that ink began with a quiet scrape in the straw, a child waking where no child should wake, and walking on wounded feet toward the first light she could find. And as the graves were measured and the inquest papers signed, another question rose, steady as a drumbeat under every conversation. The Taylor brothers were gone now. They had a head start into the South. Where were they running and how far could they get before the country closed around them? The question of where the Taylor brothers had gone was not asked casually. It was asked with a kind of edge, the way you ask after a man who has already proved what he is willing to do. By the first full day after the bodies were found, every road south felt like a threat. In North Missouri farm country, the South has always carried a double meaning. It means warmer weather and longer growing seasons, but it also means rougher hills, fewer sheriffs per mile, and more places for a desperate man to hide. When the word went out that William and George Taylor were the chief suspects, the thought of them slipping into the Ozark folds set nerves on fire. Posses formed the way they always did then, not with neat uniforms and telephones, but with men climbing onto horses before the morning chores were finished, rifles across saddle horns, and led by whoever knew the roads best. Some were deputized, some were not. In a county that had just buried children, the line between law and wrath thinned quick. The local papers described mounted groups riding hard through Lynn and Sullivan counties, then pushing on toward southern Missouri when the first tracks pointed that way. They questioned farmers at fence lines, stopped at small stores, searched creek crossings for fresh hoof marks. Every stranger on the road was stared down. Every wagon that seemed too hurried was stopped. It was not only about catching killers, it was about telling the country that it would not be hunted without hunting back. Now, the records suggest the Taylors did not dawdle after the crime. That alone is a kind of confession. Innocent men might hide close, expecting the storm to pass. Guilty men run, and they run toward places where they have allies, or where the landscape itself is an ally. Accounts say they fled almost at once, driving hard toward the south and then west, aiming for the broken country of the Ozark border and the easier disappearance it offered. There were reports of them being seen near farmsteads along the way, asking for food, new horses, or a night of shelter, sometimes under false names. You can imagine what it must have felt like for those who recognized them. A man opens his door to two travelers, then realizes he is looking at the very faces his county is scouring the roads for. Do you refuse them and risk your own life? Do you help them and risk your soul? Frontier country makes ordinary people choose between dangers that do not have good answers. In the folklore that grew later, these days of flight take on a devilish glow. Storytellers said the brothers could not be caught because they knew every hollow and ridge, because the hills themselves protected them, because a man who does evil can sometimes move like smoke through the timber. That is the kind of thing people say when fear is fresh and the landscape feels complicit. But history is plainer. The hills did not protect the Taylors. What protected them, for a while, was distance, night, and the simple fact that a posse on horseback, no matter how determined, is still chasing a man with only rumors to guide it. A killer can cross a county line in a few hours. A posse has to stop and ask questions. The chase spilled into southern Missouri and then over the state line into northern Arkansas. That border was more than a line on a map. It was a shift in jurisdiction, a shift in local loyalties, and a shift in geography. North Missouri is wide fields, open roads, and farmhouses that can see each other across ridges. The Ozark border begins to tighten and fold, offering cedar thickets, rocky ravines, and little settlements tucked beyond sight. A man can pass close to a cabin there and never be seen. He can sleep in a hollow where even the moon cannot find him. He can drift from kin to kin, from acquaintance to acquaintance, each one saying later they did not know who he was. People who had not lived it might underestimate how easy it was to vanish that way. Still, this was not a chase happening in a quiet vacuum. The Taylor brothers had not only the law behind them, but the force of public outrage. Newspapers in several Missouri towns printed their names and described them as fugitives. Their faces may not have been photographed for posters, but their reputations moved ahead of them. A rough-looking man who asked for help late at night was no longer just a stranger. He was a possible Taylor. And once a name like that is loose on the wind, any man who resembles it becomes watched. There is an old Ozark saying that a hunted man has two enemies, the sheriff and his own hunger. By the third or fourth day on the run, men who started with a head start begin to slow. Food runs out. Horses tire. A man sleeps in fits and wakes at every twig snap. He grows careless in a way he would not if he were safe. That is how most fugitive trails end, not in a grand showdown, but in the gradual wearing down of the body and will. Reports from the time indicate that William Taylor was captured in Arkansas after a pursuit. The details in different papers vary, which is common for 19th century reporting, but the core event is consistent. He was taken alive and brought back to Missouri to face trial. The capture was celebrated not with joy exactly, but with something closer to grim relief. A county that had been holding its breath could finally exhale a little. Yet even that relief carried tension. Bringing a notorious suspect back through farm country meant passing him through the very people he had outraged. Lawmen often had to guard against lynching more fiercely than against escape. In places where the state felt distant, the crowd sometimes believed it had a right to settle matters on its own rope. The fact that Taylor was delivered to court alive says something about the restraint or the discipline of those deputies, and perhaps about the community's determination to see a formal verdict, not just a quick revenge. George Taylor's path is murkier in the records. Some sources say he was captured later. Others suggest he slipped away for a time after his brother was taken. That uncertainty would feed Ozark rumor for decades. An escaped brother is a seed for endless story. People wonder where he went, who helped him, whether he changed his name and lived as a quiet farmer under another sky. In mountain tradition, the fugitive who vanishes becomes half man, half ghost. He is blamed for later misfortunes. He is spotted in every stranger with a hard jaw. He becomes a shadow that reminds people the world is not always closed and safe. We will come back to that shadow later, because it shaped the Ballads as much as the confirmed hanging did. While all these manhunts, sightings, and captures were unfolding, Nellie Meeks was healing in body, but not in spirit. The papers note her wounds, her bandaged head, her shaken state. They do not tell us what her nights were like. We can only infer. A child who has heard the last breaths of her mother and sisters does not slip back into sleep the way she did before. She wakes to every creak. She searches for familiar footsteps that will never return. She learns too early that dawn is not a guarantee. In the weeks before trial, she was kept by relatives and neighbors, and each adult around her carried the same mixture of pity and expectation. Pity because she was a little girl thrown into horror. Expectation because her words were the county's best path to justice. That pressure on a survivor is another quiet tragedy threaded through this case. We celebrate courage, and we should. But courage can also be a burden forced onto the shoulders of someone who never asked for it. Nellie's testimony would soon be given in crowded courtrooms, spoken before lawyers and strangers, repeated until the story became a scar that could not heal because it was picked at again and again. The county needed her memory to stay sharp. She needed her memory to fade enough to live. Those needs do not fit together neatly. By late summer, the chase had done what it could do. The suspect most clearly held, William Taylor, was in custody. The wheels of the court were turning. People who had been riding after the brothers returned to their farms with tired horses and a new hardness in their eyes. The corn had kept growing while they were gone. The hay had needed cutting anyway. Life always presses on, even while grief sits on the porch beside you. But no one in Lynn or Sullivan County felt the same ease about their roads anymore. Every stranger on the track was now measured against the memory of two men who had waved and talked like friends, then led a family to slaughter. And so the countryside entered another kind of waiting. Not the waiting of a posse scanning a horizon, but the waiting of a courtroom. The next chapter would not be written in fields or cedar thickets. It would be written under the high ceiling of a county courthouse, with a child witness at the center and the whole region listening for what her voice could make the law do. By the time the case settled into the courthouse, the country around Browning had already lived through a kind of trial of its own. It had buried the Meeks family, watched posses ride out, watched one suspect come back in irons, and tried to return to planting and milking and mending fences as if the world had not cracked open. But a courthouse trial is not just a legal matter in a rural county. It is a public reckoning. It is where grief is carried into a room with benches and windows and a judge's raised seat, and is asked to behave itself long enough for procedure. In 1894 and 1895, as Lynn County prepared to hear the evidence against William Taylor, that room grew heavy with more than law. It filled with the heat of a community that wanted the truth, wanted punishment, and wanted reassurance that a family could still sleep safe at night. The courthouse itself would have been a plain but proud building. the kind county seats raised to show permanence in a land that still felt half frontier. Men came in from farms on horseback and by wagon. Women came too, some out of duty to witness, some because the story had frightened them enough that they needed to see the accused with their own eyes. Children were kept home more often than not, yet every child in the county still knew what had happened. They heard it whispered over washtubs, heard it half-sung by older boys on the edge of schoolyards, heard it when their mothers told them to stay close to the house after sundown. A trial like this does not stay inside its walls. It steeps through a community like smoke. William Taylor entered that courtroom already branded in the public mind. Newspapers had called him a desperado and a murderer long before a jury was sworn. That was common for the age. Editors were not shy about their conclusions, and most readers treated their conclusions like fact. Yet the law still required the performance of fairness. There were lawyers, statements, objections, all the slow tools civilization uses to keep wrath from becoming custom. If the state wanted a conviction that would stand, it needed evidence, and above all, it needed Nellie Meeks. Picture her walking into court. She was still a small child, her head scarred, her family gone, her name now carried in every paper from Milan to Brookfield. She would have been brought in by relatives, maybe dressed in her best clothes because people believed that dignity might help her face what she had to do. A courtroom can feel like a church to a child. It is big, it is strange, it smells of wood and damp wool and ink. Everyone is looking. Everyone expects something from you that you do not fully understand. She took the stand and told her story again. She pointed to the man she said had led them away. She said the Taylor brothers had beaten her father and mother and sisters. She spoke not in the polished way adults do, but in the plain, certain language of a child who has seen what she has seen. Whoever listened to her, whether they were already convinced or still weighing, could not escape the sound of it. A child's testimony has a force that no legal argument can mimic. It is not clever. It is not crafted. It is simply there, like a stone dropped in silence. The defense, as defenses often do, tried to sift her words for weakness. Some accounts mention attempts to show she was confused by injury or by fear. That is a hard thing to watch, even now, and it would have been harder then. Yet it is also part of why trials exist. The law does not ask a jury to trust a story because it is painful. It asks them to test it. Still, the deeper truth is that children who live through terror remember with a clarity that adults sometimes underestimate. Memory in a child is not fogged by years of excuses. It is raw, and sometimes it cuts cleaner. Witnesses outside of Nellie also took the stand. The state brought in people who had seen the Taylors at the Meeks home, people who knew of the offers made to Gus, people who had tracked the fugitive's flight. There was talk of the earlier forgery case, the pardon, and how Gus's testimony threatened to send the brothers to prison. That motive fit the shape of the crime. If a man is desperate to avoid the penitentiary, he may decide that the witness must disappear. The straw stack concealment and the flight south gave motive a backbone. And in a rural court, where jurors often know the families involved, motive does not live in the abstract. It sits across from you in the face of neighbors, in the history you share. Yet even with all that, the trial was not simple. The 19th century legal system in Missouri was rougher than what we know today. Continuances were frequent. Changes of venue were requested because feelings ran so hot. Papers mention more than one hearing as the case moved through pre-trial and then full trial phases. Each delay meant the community had to keep living inside the same grief. Each delay also meant Nellie had to keep carrying the story, reopening it every time she was called. Outside the court, the county watched with a tension that bordered on dread. People feared not just the verdict, but what a verdict might trigger. If Taylor were acquitted, there was no doubt some men would have decided to deliver their own justice. If he were convicted, there was still the fear of retaliation from friends or kin, and the larger fear that the other brother might still be free. The Ozark borderlands have long understood that violence can echo. One killing can plant the seed for another if a community does not find a way to close the wound cleanly. In the folklore that grew afterward, this courtroom chapter is often compressed. The ballads skip from murder to hanging with only a verse or two in between, because songs do not linger on procedure, they linger on consequence. But the real story had these long middle days where life and law rubbed against each other. A child had to sit under cross-examination. A jury had to stare down a man they believed to be capable of slaughtering children. A judge had to keep order while sorrow shook the room. And all the while, outside, crops kept growing and chores kept calling, as if the earth itself refused to pause for human grief. Eventually, the jury returned its guilty verdict. The state had made its case. The county did not erupt in celebration. It settled instead into a grim acceptance. One kind of uncertainty had ended, but another had begun. The law now had a condemned man in its care, and Missouri still practiced hanging. The question shifted from whether William Taylor did it to when the rope would be ready. And somewhere in all this, the quietest figure of all was still Nellie. The county had used her voice to reach the verdict it needed. But what would become of a child who had stood at the heart of such darkness? How does a little girl step down from the witness stand and walk back into the ordinary world again? The courthouse doors closed behind the verdict, and the echo of that gavel fell away into the hallway, leaving another kind of silence to fill the space. The silence after the verdict was not peaceful. It was the kind of hush that comes when a storm has passed over your roof, but the air is still charged, waiting for the next strike. In Lynn County, folks went home from court carrying the weight of what had been decided. They had watched a man condemned, and if you have ever lived in a small place, you know that condemnation is not cleanly sealed inside the courthouse. It spreads into the lanes and church aisles and feed stores. Men who had sat on the jury felt the eyes of neighbors on them for weeks because everyone wanted to know if justice had been done the way justice ought to be done. Women spoke of the Meeks children in half sentences because to say their names too clearly felt like pulling a scab from a wound that had not yet set. And in every conversation, there was the same stubborn undercurrent. A verdict is not an end. A verdict is a doorway to whatever comes after. For William Taylor, whatever came after was a cell and then a scaffold. Missouri still hanged men then, and hanging was both punishment and performance. The law claimed it as a sober necessity, a way to show the county that murder had consequences even when the murdered were poor farmers with no political pull. But hanging also drew a crowd. People said they came to honor the dead or to see justice with their own eyes, or simply because curiosity is a hard weed to pull out of human nature. Reports from the time say Taylor was executed in 1896, after appeals and delays that were typical for such a high-stakes case. The long wait between verdict and rope did something strange to the county. It allowed anger to cool, but it also let imagination grow. Each month of delay was another month for rumors to sprout. Some said the Taylors had powerful friends. Some said the governor might intervene. Some said God might intervene. In farm country, the gap between court time and human time always feels wide. People who bury their children do not understand why the law moves like an old wagon in mud. When the day came, it carried that old-fashioned blend of grim ritual and ordinary bustle. The scaffold would have been built in the yard or near the jail, raised high enough for a crowd to see. Men came in their work clothes. Some brought their boys, not because they wanted them to witness death, but because boys followed fathers the way shadows do, and because the county believed even its young should learn what murder leads to. There were ministers, deputies, maybe a doctor to pronounce the end. The condemned man was brought out, and the law asked him for final words. We do not need to dress those words in drama we cannot prove. 19th century papers sometimes printed a condemned man's statement, but they often shaped it to taste. Some men confessed, Some denied. Some tried to send a warning to the living. Whatever Taylor said, the rope was already waiting. A hanging is a strange thing to remember for a community. It is meant to close a wound, but it also creates a new picture that never quite fades. For the families who love the Meeks, no rope could balance the scales. For many others, the execution felt like a necessary line drawn in the dirt, an announcement that even in a rural county, a man could not slaughter children and walk away. Yet there were also people who could not stomach it. They stayed home, shut their doors, and let the day pass without looking toward town. Older Ozark and border folk have always had a quiet streak of mercy in them, even when they believe in punishment. They do not like to watch death for sport. They will say a man must answer for his crimes, but they do not want to see him fall through a trapdoor to prove the point. After the crowd drifted away and the scaffold was dismantled, a part of the county's fear loosened, but another part stayed hooked. Because even with William Taylor dead, the name Taylor was not finished with the story. The question of George Taylor remained hanging in the air like smoke. Some sources say he was captured and tried as well. Others hint he escaped for years, slipping deeper into the Ozark borderlands or vanishing west. That conflict in the record is not just a historian's headache. It is the seed of folklore. When the papers give you an ending you do not completely trust, the hills step in and provide another one. In some local tellings, George becomes the wandering brother, doomed to haunt the roads that carried him away. People said he was seen in Arkansas, in the hills above the White River, in the back corners of Taney or Stone County, always under a different hat, always moving at night. Some said he died in a shootout and was buried under a false name. Some said he lived to old age, married and never spoke of what he had done. None of that is documented. What is documented is that the uncertainty itself lasted long enough to matter. An uncertain fugitive is like a splinter you cannot pull free. You keep worrying it with your tongue. You keep imagining where it might travel. A county that has lived through a family massacre does not like loose ends. Loose ends feel like open doors to the same kind of nightmare returning. That is why, even after the hanging, mothers still looked twice when a man rode up their lane. It is why fathers still made their sons carry lanterns when they had to go to a barn after dark. It is why old men at stove corners still said now and then that the other Taylor was never truly accounted for. The law can declare an ending. Fear does not always accept it. Fear has its own calendar. And through all this, Nellie Meeks remained a living hinge between the county's need for closure and the county's ongoing dread. She had watched one killer hang, at least in the sense that the news would have reached her, and the adults around her would have spoken of it in tones meant to reassure. But reassurance is thin medicine for a child who has already learned that evil can wear a friendly face. The papers note that she was taken in by relatives. They do not tell us how she reacted to the execution or to the continued talk of George. Some survivors want a killer dead. Some survivors cannot bear to think about the killer at all. Either way, Nellie was still a little girl in a world where grown-ups kept turning to her story. Even when she was not speaking, she carried it. People would look at her and their minds would slide back to that straw stack in the field. A survivor becomes a kind of memorial walking on 2 feet. Years later, when the murder ballads of the Meeks family traveled through Missouri and down toward the Ozarks, the scaffold scene and the missing brother scene became twin pillars of the tale. One brother gets his rope. The other is either caught or vanishes, depending on the singer. That split ending is not accidental. It reflects the way communities live with tragedy. Part of the story needs a hard conclusion, a clear punishment that says the world still has order. Another part needs a shadow, because tragedy rarely cleans itself up as neatly as a verdict. People knew from their own lives that sometimes a man does wrong and never answers for it. So the ballad left room for that bitterness as well. In the end, the scaffold was taken down, the courthouse emptied, and William Taylor's body was buried somewhere without ceremony. The county returned to plowing and planting because it had no choice. But the name Meeks did not fade. It settled into the oral memory of the region, especially because a child had survived to carry it. The hills and prairies both began to do what they always do with a wound that deep. They started turning it into story. And if you listened hard on certain evenings, when neighbors gathered and someone picked up a fiddle, you could already hear the first hints of a tune that would not let the dead rest in silence. A tune that began with wagon wheels in the dark and ended with a rope creaking in the wind, while somewhere beyond the edge of lamplight, the question of the missing brother still moved through the trees. After the rope had done what ropes do and the crowd had drifted home, the countryside entered the long, uneasy stretch that follows any public tragedy. The papers kept printing for a while, but ink cannot stay excited forever. Another fire, another election, another scandal would take its place. Yet in the kitchens and fields of Lynn and Sullivan counties, the Meeks killings did not slide away into yesterday. They stayed close, like a bruise you feel every time you lift something heavy. People said less about the crime as the months passed, but they did not think about it less. They carried it into the way they judged strangers, into the way they talked about law and sin, into the way they looked at their own children when they were sleeping. And in the middle of that quiet reckoning stood Nellie Meeks, the child who had come home from the straw stack. If the other victims became names on gravestones, Nellie became something more complicated. She was living proof that the story had not ended in the field. She was also a reminder that the story had never truly belonged to outsiders in the first place. Her survival forced the community to look at the tragedy in a human way. Without her, the Meeks Massacre might have become an awful headline and a memory that blurred with time. With her, it stayed sharp because she could walk into a room and make people remember what night had done. The record of Nellie's later life is thin, but we can follow its outline with care. Newspapers at the time note that she was placed with relatives after her wounds healed. That was the ordinary solution in farm country. There were no state agencies to help an orphaned child. There were only kin, neighbors, and the hard choice of who had enough resources to take on another mouth. Some later accounts say she lived with an aunt or grandparents, moving as families moved, growing up in the same region that kept singing about her tragedy. We do not have a full family tree to trace here, and I will not pretend we do. But we can say this: she did not vanish from local memory. People continued to know who she was. What was it like to grow up under that kind of knowing? Imagine being a girl who cannot remember her mother's voice without also remembering the last time she heard it. Imagine being old enough to attend a country schoolhouse and hearing other children whisper your name when you pass, not because they mean to be cruel, but because they do not know any other way to hold such a story. In rural communities, children learn the rules of sorrow early. They see funerals. They see illness. They hear tales of outlaws and feuds. Yet they are still children. They still want to play, to laugh, to belong. Nellie had to do that while carrying a grief that had no companion her own age. That kind of childhood makes a person older on the inside than her years show. And then there is the question of her own voice. The Meeks story became a ballad, and the ballad became widely known across Missouri and down into the Ozark borderlands. Some versions of local lore say Nellie herself sang it in later years, either as a way to make a little money at gatherings or as a way to keep her family alive in memory. Other scholars and collectors caution that this may be romantic embroidery, the kind communities add because they want the survivor to have agency in the story. The truth is, we cannot confirm it, but we can ask why people wanted to believe it. In Ozark and border tradition, the one who survives does not just escape. She carries the meaning of the tragedy forward. If Nellie sang the song, it would mean she chose to shape the grief rather than be shaped by it. It would mean she turned the wound into witness. Even if she never sang a note in public, the fact that people longed for that image tells us something about the region's sense of endurance. because ballads here are not entertainment alone. They are a community's memory set to rhythm. The Meeks ballad did not rise because one songwriter in a city decided to profit. It rose because the story fit into an older pattern. In the 19th century, Ozarks and Ozark-adjacent country, murder songs traveled by word of mouth and by cheap printed broadsides passed hand to hand. A fiddler would learn a tune at a dance, carry it to another county, and the words would shift a little each time, because memory is a living thing. One singer might emphasize Gus's bargain with the Taylors, another might linger on Delora's plea, another might center Nellie and her escape. That is how folk tradition works. Each singer carries the same spine of fact, but adds the flesh of what matters to their own listeners. If you look at the versions that survived into collectors' notebooks, you notice the same steady elements repeating. The family is lured by a promise of money or safety. They ride at night. They are killed in a field. A child survives. The killers flee south. Justice comes by hanging. Those are historical beats. But around those beats, the songwriters placed moral meaning. The Meeks ballad is not only a chronicle, it is a warning against trusting criminals, a lament for innocence, and a reminder that the land can hold darkness as well as beauty. In that sense, the ballad did what the courthouse could not do. The courthouse punished one man and filed the case away. The ballad kept turning it over, asking what it meant. There is also a quieter cultural layer in these songs, one the Ozarks understands in its bones. The Meeks family were poor farmers, not politicians or merchants. Their deaths mattered enough to become regional folklore because the Ozarks have never believed that only the powerful deserve remembrance. A tragedy in a cabin can be as large as a tragedy in a mansion, sometimes larger, because it feels closer to the lives most people live. When the Meeks ballad spread, it carried a kind of class witness too. It said that even common people have stories the hills will not let die. Yet for Nellie herself, that spreading story may have been a double-edged thing. On one hand, it kept her family present in the world. On the other, it risked trapping her in the moment of her worst night. Survivors often live in that tension. They want the world to remember what happened because forgetting feels like a second death for those they loved. But they also want a life beyond it. We cannot know which way Nellie's heart leaned as she grew. We can only say that the community's memory leaned hard toward keeping the story alive, and her name was tied to it forever. As years moved on, the Meeks case began to shift from fresh horror into something closer to legend. People in the next generation heard it not from newspapers, but from grandparents. The straw stack field became a place spoken about with a certain caution. Some said it was haunted. Some said strange lights were seen there, or that animals balked at passing near Jenkins Cemetery. Those tales are not in the court record, and we should not pretend they are, but they are part of cultural truth. A place of cruelty often gathers superstition around it because people need a way to name what they still feel. A haunting story is the language of unresolved grief. So by the early 20th century, the Meeks family massacre had become two things at once. It was a documented crime anchored in motive, testimony, and a hanging. And it was a floating story carried by song into the Ozark world that loves and fears its own past. The truth and the legend traveled together, sometimes holding hands, sometimes pulling apart. And the longer they traveled, the more one question kept changing shape without ever leaving the trail. Did the ballad tell the story the way it truly happened, or had the hills begun to add their own echoes? In the next stretch, we will walk into those echoes, listening to where fact ends, where folklore begins, and why a single child's survival became a tune that the Ozarks refused to stop singing. When a story like the Meeks family massacre turns into a ballad, it does not stop being history, but it does begin to travel in a different way. It passes from courthouse pages into human breath, and breath is never a perfect vessel. It warms what it carries. It reshapes edges. It sometimes adds a line where silence used to be. That is why, if you sit with the Meeks ballads long enough, you start to hear two voices braided together, One voice is the newspaper and the inquest, plain and hard. The other is the hill country imagination, not lying exactly, but leaning toward meaning, toward warning, toward the kind of truth that feels larger than dates and names. Collectors who studied Ozark folk music in the early 20th century found more than one version of this song. Some were short and clipped, the way a work song might be, meant to be carried while hoeing a row or riding a wagon. Others were longer, with spare verses that lingered on the children or on Nellie's escape. The core remained steady. A family is taken at night. A promise of safety or money is offered. The road runs south. The killing happens in a field. A child survives. A brother hangs. That skeleton is history's own, but around it the singers laid their own bones of feeling. One set of verses emphasizes Gus Meeks as a man caught between law and outlaw life. Some versions call him a witness who would not be bought, making him almost a martyr for justice. That fits the record in broad strokes, since newspapers say he was expected to testify and was offered money to flee. But it also softens the rougher parts of his earlier trouble. Folk songs tend to do that. They are not interested in a man's full complexity. They are interested in the lesson he can carry. So Gus becomes the righteous farmer who refused to bend, because that version helps the community believe their world still has moral lines that matter. Another set of verses leans on Delora, turning her into the heart of the domestic tragedy. She is sometimes given lines she never spoke in the record, pleading for her children, begging mercy from men who would not hear it. We cannot confirm those exact words, but we do not need to in order to understand why they were added. In Ozark tradition, the mother is the last wall of a home. When that wall is broken, the story feels unbearable unless the song gives her a voice. A ballad grants dignity to the dead by letting them speak in our place. Most striking of all are the verses about Nellie. In some renditions, she is not only a witness, but a kind of wandering symbol. The little girl who walks out of the dark with blood on her face and truth on her tongue. A few versions go further, suggesting she sang the story herself afterward, carrying it from camp meeting to camp meeting. As we said before, that detail is not securely documented, but it keeps appearing because it answers a quiet hunger in the region. People do not like thinking of a child survivor as helpless forever. They want to believe she grew into someone who could hold her own pain in her hands and shape it into warning for others. The Hills love a survivor who becomes a storyteller because that feels like the right order of things. It turns suffering into purpose. Then there are the additions that tilt toward mystery. Some ballads speak of the killers being trailed by a restless spirit or of a curse following the Taylor name. None of that is in the courthouse record, but it is part of what happens when a community has no other language for the way evil ripples outward. If a crime is too brutal to fit inside ordinary human motive, people reach for the supernatural not because they are foolish, but because they are trying to keep the world from feeling random. A curse is a way of saying, this was not only crime, it was a violation of the moral weather itself. And yet, if we hold the ballad up to the facts, we can see where it stays true and where it drifts. The documented motive that Gus was a threatened witness and had been offered money to run fits the song's frame. The midnight ride and the field killing fit. The survival of Nellie fits. The hanging of William Taylor fits. Where the song begins to pull away is in the way it sharpens men into pure types. The Taylors become demons without human edges. Gus becomes wholly upright. Delora becomes wholly sainted. The countryside becomes a stage where all motives are cleanly moral rather than tangled in fear, desperation, pride, and bad choices. That is not a flaw in the song. It is the nature of song. A ballad is not a court transcript. It is a lantern carried through the dark, and lantern light always throws long shadows. There is another reason the Meeks ballad endured, and it has less to do with the Taylors than with Ozark culture itself. The Ozarks, and the farm and prairie country that leans toward them, have always lived close to the possibility of sudden violence. This is not because Ozark people are violent by nature. It is because the region spent centuries on the margin, where law arrives late, where feuds can grow, where poverty tightens tempers, and where isolation can make cruelty easier to hide. Murder ballads are a way of dealing with that reality. They do not just tell you what happened. They tell you what might happen if you trust wrong, if you travel at night with men who have already shown you who they are, if you let fear drive you instead of wisdom. In that sense, the Meeks song became a kind of community fence line. It marked the boundary between the safe world people wanted to believe in and the unsafe world they knew existed underneath. If you imagine an old fiddler playing this tune on a winter night, you can see why it moved people. The melody would be simple, easy to learn. The words would be plain enough for anyone to follow, but the feeling underneath would be heavy as wet wool. Each verse would turn the listener's mind toward their own family, their own children, their own road home after dark. And when the song ended, it would not end with a neat explanation. It would end with a picture, a grave, a hanging, a child's voice in the dawn. That is how folk tradition respects tragedy. It does not solve it, it holds it. So when we ask truth versus legend, we are not asking which one is worth more. We are asking what each one does. The truth gives us the chain of events, the motive, the names, the dates. The legend gives us the emotional map of how people lived with those events afterward. One tells us what happened in May of 1894. The other tells us what May of 1894 did to the hearts of those who carried it forward. And now we come to the place where those two voices begin to argue. Because even in the factual record there are gaps, and the gaps are where folklore moves in like water. The deepest gap of all is the question that never stopped rustling through the straw of this story. What about the other brother? Was George Taylor truly caught? Or did he vanish into the southern hills and live on as a shadow that the law never put its hand on? Listen close, because the next part of our trail is where rumor and record meet at a fork in the road, and the wind off the Ozark border begins to carry two different endings at once. That fork in the road where rumor and record meet is a familiar place in Ozark story. It is the place where a community tries to decide what it knows and what it feels, and whether those two things can live side by side without tearing each other apart. With the Meeks family massacre, the fork centers on George Taylor. William's fate is nailed down by court and scaffold. George's is not. And because it is not, the Ozarks and the border counties did what they have always done with uncertainty. They filled it with voices. In the printed record, there are hints that George was pursued and perhaps captured, but the coverage is scattered and not always consistent. Some papers focus so hard on William's trial and execution that George became almost a footnote, as if once one brother hanged, the story did not need another chapter. That is a weakness of newspaper history. Editors went where the heat was. If crowds gathered for a hanging, they printed about the hanging. If a fugitive slipped out of sight in the hills, they often printed less because there was less to sell. And so the surviving sources leave us with a haze. Enough to say George was implicated in the crime and fled with William. Not enough to say with peace, here is exactly how his trail ended. To a region already raw with grief, that haze felt like an open door. People began asking the question in every shape they could. Did George die on the run? Did he get caught later and face a quieter punishment? Did he cross deeper into Arkansas and melt into the Ozark folds where a man can change his name as easily as he changes his shirt? The question mattered because it was not only about one man. It was about whether justice in their world was complete or partial, whether the law had teeth or only bark, whether evil sometimes slips through no matter how hard good people chase it. You can see how quickly the uncertainty became folklore if you listen to the way later storytellers handled George. In some ballad versions, he is hanged alongside William, the story cleanly tied with twin ropes. That is the tidy moral ending people want. In other versions, he escapes and is never heard from more, a line that lands like a stone in a pond, sending ripples out in the listener's mind. Those two endings exist side by side because the region itself lived with two feelings side by side, the need for closure and the fear that closure is sometimes a luxury. Oral tradition went further. Once a man becomes a shadow in community memory, he begins to be seen everywhere. People in later decades claimed they had heard of George Taylor hiding in the hills above the White River, or slipping through timbered hollows near the Arkansas line, or working under another name in a logging camp. None of this is proven. None of it should be treated as fact. But it is still worth listening to, because rumor carries the shape of a community's anxiety. A fugitive who disappears becomes a vessel into which people pour all the larger fears they cannot name directly. When there is a drought, the shadow is blamed. When a barn burns, the shadow is blamed. When a stranger rides through and looks too long at a pasture, the shadow is blamed. In this way, the missing brother becomes a living part of the landscape, a warning that danger can rise from within your own county and then return when you least expect it. Why did this particular shadow stick so hard? Partly because the Meeks murders were so extreme, a crime that brutal makes people suspect the killers were capable of anything, including slipping away forever. Partly because the flight route ran toward the Ozark border itself. The hills are beautiful, but they also teach a kind of humility about what can be found. A man can hide in them for weeks on squirrel meat and creek water. He can be sheltered by kin who do not ask questions. He can sleep in a bluff cave a day's ride from town, and no one will ever know. The Ozarks are not a magical cloak, but they are a practical one. People who lived there knew that in their bones, which is why they were willing to believe George had vanished into them. And there is something else. In a small place, people do not like the idea that a killer can outlast the story. If George escaped, then he outsmarted not only deputies, but neighbors. Not only the law, but the moral order the community leaned on. That possibility is harder to bear than the known cruelty of the crime itself. So in some tellings, people had to find a way to punish him, even without proof. They said he died ill in a hollow, or that he was shot by a farmer who recognized him, or that he went mad and wandered until he froze. Those are not records. They are wishes dressed as outcomes, but they show how hunger for justice can create its own ending. Still, an honest storyteller has to keep one hand on the courthouse and one hand on the porch. The courthouse hand says this: we know William Taylor was convicted and executed. We know the Taylors fled together. We know George was named as participant. Beyond that, we have uncertainty. The porch hand says this: in the years after, people lived as though George might still be out there somewhere. And that belief shaped their behavior. It shaped which roads they took at night. It shaped the way they locked doors. It shaped the way they judged the men their daughters courted. Whether George was truly free or not, the fear of his freedom was real, and fear has consequences. This is the point where truth versus legend becomes less a contest and more a braid. The truth gives the crime and the confirmed punishment. The legend gives the emotional afterlife. Neither cancels the other. Together, they explain why the Meeks massacre kept haunting the region. If the story had ended cleanly with 2 convictions and 2 hangings, it might have settled sooner into history. But with one brother hanging and the other fading into the mist, the tale never fully lay down. It remained active in the cultural bloodstream, a reminder that life on the edge of the Ozarks could still be unsettled, that there were cracks in the wall of law. And through all this, you can feel the Meeks family themselves slowly transforming into something larger. In the first year after the murders, they were a specific household, mourned by relatives who could name each laugh and habit. A decade later, they were also symbol, a family destroyed by betrayal, children taken in the dark, a survivor who carried the truth home. The Ozarks and border counties have always honored families that way, not by polishing them into saints, but by holding them up as the people you might have been, or the neighbors you might have had if fate had leaned another direction. So the shadow of George Taylor is not just a curiosity. It is part of the moral weather that settled over the region after 1894. It is the part of the story that says, even when one killer hangs, the world can still feel unfinished. It is also the part that makes the ballad linger, because ballads thrive on uncertainty. A story that is too neatly solved is less likely to be sung. A story with a missing road, a door left ajar, a brother who slips into the timber and may never be seen again. That is the sort of thing people carry in their mouths for generations. Yet in the end, even a shadow grows faint if you stare at it long enough. As the years turned, the loudest presence in the Meeks story was not the fugitive brother. It was Nellie. Her survival was the candle the community kept relighting. The question of George might have kept fear alive, but Nellie kept memory alive. And memory, in Ozark country, is what turns tragedy into a thing that can be faced without flinching. Listen now for the next echo, because after rumor runs its course, culture does something else. It takes what frightens it and weaves it into identity. The Meeks Massacre did not only terrify the Ozark fringe, it altered the way people understood trust, kinship, and the fragile line between neighbor and threat. That influence is the next stretch of our trail, and it begins not with a rope or a fugitive, but with the way a community teaches its children to live after the dark has shown its teeth. After a crime like this, a community does not simply go back to the way it was. It may look like it does from a distance. The corn still gets planted. The hogs still get fattened. Church bells still call on Sunday. Weddings and funerals still pass each other on the same roads. But underneath that ordinary surface, the people have shifted. Something in their shared understanding of the world has been bent, and even if they never name it plainly, they begin living by new rules. In the Ozark fringe, and in the Ozarks proper, those rules are often taught through story more than through sermon. That is why the Meeks Massacre did not stay a Lynn County affair. It slid into the cultural bloodstream of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas because it offered an especially sharp lesson about trust. In communities where you depend on neighbors for survival, trust is not a polite feeling. It is a kind of infrastructure. You trust a man to lend you his mule for a day. You trust a woman to watch your children while you ride to town. You trust that if your barn catches fire in the night, someone will come running. When trust is broken in a way this brutal, people do not decide to live without it. They cannot. They do something subtler. They narrow it. They become careful about where they spend it and with whom. You could see that narrowing in the years after 1894 in small habits that never make the newspaper. Older folks started warning younger ones more fiercely about traveling at night with men they did not know. Fathers told sons in low voices that there was a difference between a man who had made a mistake and a man who had built his life out of mistakes. Mothers told daughters to notice not only how a suitor spoke in front of others, but how his eyes moved when he thought no one was watching. Neighbors who once might have let a stranger sleep in a hayloft without asking questions now wanted a name, a county, a kinship tie. In hard country, hospitality is sacred, but it is not blind. The Meeks story sharpened that edge. It also deepened the old Ozark belief that law, while necessary, is never enough by itself. The region has a long memory of times when sheriffs were far away, or corrupt, or simply overwhelmed. Even when the state did its work in the Meeks case, convicting and hanging William Taylor, the community still felt the lag between danger and response. The killings happened in a field that was a short ride from home, under cover of night, with no deputy in sight. That reality fed a quiet self-reliance that Ozark people already carried. It reminded them that the first line of defense is not a courthouse. It is your own judgment, your own caution, and the watchfulness of your neighbors. Through the songs, that cautiousness took on a moral tone. The ballads do not only say, "This happened," they say, "This can happen again if you forget what kind of world you live in." The Meeks Ballad sits in a tradition of Ozark murder songs that serve as communal warning lights. They are not meant to make people despair. They are meant to make people stay awake. People sang about the Meeks tragedy the way they sang about other killings, drownings, and betrayals, because each song was a tool for remembering what the Hills had learned the hard way. In that sense, the Meeks family became part of a larger regional scripture, a chapter in the unwritten book of what the Ozarks knows about human nature. There was also a change in how the region spoke about children and vulnerability. In older frontier rhetoric, people often praised toughness above all else. A child was expected to grow up fast, to pull a little weight, to learn the hard parts of living early. The Meeks murders did not erase that expectation, but they layered it with a gentler grief. People who had once believed that only grown men were targets of violence had to face the truth that children could be swept into the worst of it as well. That realization did not make the countryside soft. It made it more protective in a quiet way. It is one thing to hear that a man has been killed over a feud or a theft. It is another to hear that small girls have been clubbed in a field because they happen to belong to the wrong household at the wrong time. A society can absorb the first kind of violence without changing its sense of the world. The second kind forces a deeper reckoning. And in all of that reckoning, Nellie remained the living bridge between the crime and the culture. Even if she never sang the ballad herself, she was the reason the ballad sounded the way it did. A family massacre without a survivor becomes a tale told from outside, built on rumor and reconstruction. A family massacre with a survivor carries a different gravity. It is anchored by a voice that says, "I was there, and I walked out." That voice does not let a community drift too far into fantasy. It keeps the story pressed against reality, no matter how much legend grows around it. Still, communities do not only use stories to warn, they use them to belong. This is another Ozark truth that can be hard to see unless you have lived close to it. People in these hills and borderlands hold their histories as a kind of shared possession. When they sing an old murder ballad, they are saying, "This is part of who we are." Not because they love death, but because they refuse to let other people tell them what matters. The Meeks Ballad spread beyond Lynn County because it carried a feeling that fit the Ozark sense of itself. The feeling that life is fragile, that evil can come from familiar places, and that endurance sometimes looks like a child walking through dawn with blood on her face and truth in her mouth. In later years, as the Ozarks faced new waves of change, the Meeks story remained useful for different reasons. The early 20th century brought more rail lines, more strangers passing through, more sense that the world outside was pressing in. The Great Depression brought hunger and theft back into hard focus. The war years pulled young men away and returned some of them changed. In each of those eras, old stories were not relics, they were mirrors. People looked into them and saw the shapes of fear they were still living with. That is why a ballad born in 1894 could still be sung or at least remembered into the middle of the 20th century. It had become bigger than its origin. It had become a regional landmark, like a creek crossing or a graveyard you pass without stopping, but never quite ignore. Yet even as culture reshapes tragedy into memory, it never completely resolves the ache underneath. If you talk to old families in the Ozark borderlands, they will tell you that some crimes stay close, no matter how many years pass. They are not brought up every day, but when they are, the room changes. Voices drop. People look at the stove or out the window. Someone says a name, and everyone else knows which story is attached to it. The Meeks name became that kind of name. It was a shorthand for betrayal, for the danger of desperate men, for the way a community can be wounded in its very sense of neighborliness. So the influence of the Meeks Massacre is not only that it produced a famous ballad, it is that the ballad and the memory behind it helped shape the moral posture of a region. It tightened trust where trust needed tightening. It deepened caution without destroying hospitality. It reminded people that law matters, but so does the vigilance of ordinary families. It gave the Ozarks another story to hold in its rough hands and say, "This is what we have survived, and this is what we must never forget." And still, after all that cultural shaping, there remains the question that keeps the story from ever feeling fully settled. How much of what we remember is truly the Meeks family, and how much is what we need them to represent? When we sing of them, are we honoring their lives, or are we using their deaths to steady our own fears? That is not an accusation. It is a human dilemma. Every community that lives long enough wrestles with it. The old ballad does not answer that question. It leaves it hanging in the air between verses. And if you listen hard at the end of the song, you can almost hear a field at dawn again, straw shifting softly in a breeze, as though the land itself is asking us to look closer at what we call truth and what we call legend, and how the two keep walking together down the same long road. That long road between truth and legend is not a straight one, and the Meeks story shows us every bend in it. When a tragedy is fresh, people cling to facts like fence posts in a flood. Names, dates, the place the bodies were found, the man who was hanged, the child who survived. Those are the hard points that keep a community from drifting into helplessness. But as the years pass and the sharpness of daily grief dulls into something quieter, the mind reaches for other tools. It asks not only what happened, but why it happened, and what it means that it could happen at all. Those questions are where legend begins to grow, not because people want to lie, but because human beings are built to search for meaning the way roots search for water. You can see that meaning hunger in the rumors that spread almost immediately after the massacre. Even before William Taylor stood on the scaffold, some neighbors whispered that there must have been others involved. They said 2 men alone could not have controlled a grown man and a woman and 3 children in the dark. They said somebody else must have been watching the road, or holding the horses, or helping drag the bodies under straw. It is a plausible fear, but plausibility is not proof. The court record, as far as we can trace it through newspaper summaries, centered on the Taylor brothers, with Nellie's testimony pointing to them, and with motive anchored in Gus's expected witness role. That is the spine of fact. Yet the rumor of accomplices kept moving anyway, because it matched the way rural people understand outlaw life. In their experience, theft and violence rarely travel alone. A man who steals cattle often has a cousin who looks the other way, a friend who buys cheap beef, a neighbor who warns him when the sheriff is riding out. So even if the Meeks killings were done by 2 hands, the community could not help imagining a wider circle. The rumor was the county trying to guard against being fooled again. Another set of rumors leaned toward a different kind of motive. Some storytellers later hinted that the killing was not only about silencing Gus, but about money hidden in the Meeks' belongings, or about a private feud that went deeper than court testimony. Here we have to be steady. The papers say robbery did occur, small jewelry taken from Nellie, possible cash or goods carried off with the wagon. But there is no firm evidence that greed alone drove the crime. The more consistent motive in contemporaneous reporting is fear of Gus's testimony. When witnesses are murdered on the eve of trial, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Still, rural people know that fear and greed often travel together. A desperate man may kill to save himself and then take what he can on the way out, because once you have stepped across that line, another step feels smaller. The rumor of a deeper money motive may be less about what truly happened and more about how people tried to picture the killer's hearts. Then there are the legends that drifted toward the supernatural. Within a few years, some locals said the straw stack field was haunted. They spoke of odd lights, of dogs refusing to cross certain corners of land, of a chill that settled without reason near Jenkins Cemetery. These claims are not in the record, and we should not treat them as history. But we can treat them as cultural confession. A haunted field is a way of saying, the earth remembers what we cannot stop remembering. Ozark people are practical, but they are not strangers to mystery. When a place has been soaked in grief, it feels different. Even a skeptic senses it. So a haunting legend is not always a claim about ghosts. Sometimes it is a claim about the weight of memory. What makes these legends grow faster is the thinness of official detail. The papers of 1894 gave plenty of headlines and some hard facts, but they did not deliver a full, minute-by-minute reconstruction the way modern investigation might. They printed what they could gather quickly, and they printed it with language that leaned toward the dramatic. That left room for imagination. When a community does not have a thick official account to rest on, it builds its own. Each witness remembers one extra sound. Each neighbor adds an observation heard secondhand. Each reteller smooths over a gap by inserting what feels likely. Over time, those insertions become part of the story itself, and few people remember which parts were added. So how do we sort truth from legend without insulting the people who carried the legend? We do it by asking what each layer is doing. The factual layer tells us that William and George Taylor lured the Meeks family out at night with promises, led them into a field near their own farm ground, killed Gus, Delora, Hattie and Mary with a blunt weapon, beat Nellie and left her for dead, hid the bodies under straw, fled south, and that William was captured, convicted, and hanged. Those points are supported by multiple newspaper and court-related reports. They are strong enough to stand even with the roughness of 19th century journalism. The legendary layer adds emphasis and moral coloring. It makes Gus more purely upright, the Taylors more purely demon, Nellie more mythically guided. It imagines a missing brother as a roaming shadow. It adds curses and hauntings. Those things are not confirmed, but they are meaningful in another register. They show us what the community needed in order to live with what happened. There is a temptation when you study old crimes to sneer at legend as mere distortion. But that is not fair to how human memory works. If you had been a farmer in 1894, living a day's ride from the Meeks place, you would not have processed this massacre like a historian at a desk. You would have processed it like a parent, a neighbor, a Christian, a person who needed to understand whether your own household was safe. You would have asked yourself what signs you had missed, what you would do if strangers came to your door at night, how you could ever trust your children to sleep without fear. In that emotional weather, legend grows the way moss grows on the north side of a tree, quietly, naturally, almost without being noticed. Still, there are specific places where legend may pull us away from the most likely truth, and it helps to look at them plainly. One is the question of why Nellie survived. Some folktellers say the killers spared her out of sudden mercy, or because they thought her too young to matter, or because some unseen hand protected her. The record points to something simpler and more chilling. She survived because they believed she was dead. They struck her and left her, and their mistake gave her life. Survival in such cases is often not a miracle in the storybook sense. It is the brutal arithmetic of violence failing to finish its work. That does not make her survival less extraordinary. It makes it more grounded in the terrible randomness that can exist inside human cruelty. Another is the question of whether the Meeks family knew they were in danger. Some ballads suggest they suspected betrayal and pleaded anyway. The likely truth is that they were deceived enough to travel willingly until the trap closed. The absence of any reported struggle on the road supports that. Their trust was used against them. That feels worse to people than imagining a chance at resistance, which is why songs sometimes insert a plea or a warning. Songs want to honor the victims by giving them a voice, even if history never recorded it. And then there is the missing brother again, always at the edge of firelight. The truth says we cannot be sure of George Taylor's end. The legend says he escaped and haunted the world. Both statements can coexist without one erasing the other, as long as we are honest about which is which. If we insist on a clean ending, we do not have. We dishonor history. If we dismiss the shadow entirely, we dishonor the way people actually lived with fear. So in this part of our trail, we do not choose between truth and legend the way a judge chooses between guilt and innocence. We hold them up together and ask what each one reveals. The truth reveals the outline of a real human crime, committed by real human hands. The legend reveals the aftershock, the way a county and then a region tried to absorb that crime into its sense of itself without being shattered by it. And perhaps that is the most Ozark thing about this story. The hills and borderlands have always known that history is not only what happened, it is what happened plus what we carry forward. The Meeks massacre happened in a field under straw and moonlight, but it also happened in the decades after. Each time a grandmother warned her grandchild about trusting smooth voices in the night. Each time a fiddler let the melody fall soft over a room. Each time a man riding home at dusk remembered wagon wheels in the dark and tightened his grip on the reins. The field near Jenkins Cemetery is quiet now. Crops have risen and fallen there for more than a century. The straw stacks are long gone. Yet if you stand in a place like that in early morning, when the air is still and the birds are only beginning their calls, you can feel why a story like this never quite lays down. The land looks ordinary, but the memory inside it is not. And somewhere between what we know for sure and what we can only feel, the Ozarks keeps walking that road. Because walking it is how a people comes to terms with the dark without letting the dark own them. If the Meeks story has a quiet center, it is not the courthouse or the scaffold or even the straw stack itself. It is the way the tragedy settled into the Ozark fringe and then seeped deeper into Ozark culture, shaping how people spoke about danger, kinship, and the thin line between neighborliness and vulnerability. A murder can end in a night. Its influence can last for generations, and that influence is rarely loud. It is braided into daily habits, lullabies, warnings, and the way a region learns to hold its own past without breaking beneath it. In the years after 1894, the Meeks family massacre became a kind of moral landmark along the border of Missouri and the Ozarks. It joined a long roster of locally remembered crimes and tragedies that people used to mark boundaries in their minds. There were older tales of feuds in the hills, of ambushes on creek roads, of families ruined by drink or debt, of outlaws hiding in cedar thickets. The Meeks killings slid into that list because they carried a particular sting. They were not a feud between equals. They were not the heat of a fight gone too far. They were betrayal dressed as help, violence poured onto the helpless, and the wiping out of a household for the sake of a witness. That pattern struck at the very heart of rural identity. It said that even the bedrock assumption of neighbor trust could be used as a weapon. Ozark people have always prized family ties above nearly anything else. A household is more than a private unit here. It is a small kingdom of labor, faith, and survival. To destroy a household is to violate what the hills treat as sacred order. That is why the Meeks story was remembered not simply as a murder, but as a family massacre. The word itself carries weight. It signals that something bigger than an individual life was taken. It tells listeners, this was an assault on the structure that holds us together. For a region already shaped by isolation and self-reliance, that kind of assault becomes a point of cultural vigilance. You can trace the influence in the way people in Ozark and border counties continued telling their children about the case long after the newspapers had gone quiet. They did not tell it to frighten kids for sport. They told it the way you tell a child about storms or snakes. This is part of the world. You are not safe just because your home is humble. You must learn to watch. You must learn to weigh a man not by his polite words, but by the life he has shown you. Fathers said it to sons who were starting to ride alone to town. Mothers said it to daughters who were beginning to notice young men's attentions. Grandparents said it to any child who wanted to wander farther from the yard than daylight allowed. Through such telling, the Meeks tragedy became a lesson in the ethics of caution. At the same time, the story also deepened a strain of compassion in the region, because Ozark culture is not all hard edges. It is tender in its own quiet way, especially toward the suffering of children. The figure of Nellie Meeks walking, wounded through dawn, did not just inspire fear. It inspired a kind of awe. She became the emblem of survival amid cruelty, and in doing so, she reinforced an Ozark respect for those who endure what seems unendurable. The hills have always admired toughness, but not the swaggering kind. They admire the stubborn kind, the kind that keeps moving even when the body is small and the world has turned against it. Nellie's survival fit into that moral admiration and helped shape it for later generations. The Meeks Ballad served as a cultural vessel for this admiration and this caution. In Ozark tradition, songs are not merely stories set to melody. They are tools for carrying memory through time, when few things are written down. A ballad has a way of slipping into a person's ear when they are young and staying there a lifetime. The Meeks song, with its plain words and heavy refrain, taught the story without making it a lecture. It let people feel the warning rather than only hear it. It also let them mourn without having to stand at a grave each time. Singing is one of the Ozarks' quiet ways of grieving together. There is another influence that shows up if you listen to the way older Ozark folks talk about law. The Meeks case, because it did produce a conviction and a hanging, became a rare example where formal justice did arrive. That mattered. It showed a rural county that the state could act decisively when pressed. Yet the mass killing and the flight south also underscored how fragile that justice felt in the moment of crisis. In cultural memory, the story carries both messages at once. It says, law can catch you, even in the hills. And it says, law may come too late to save what matters most. That double message fed a long-standing Ozark posture toward authority, respectful but not reliant, hopeful but cautious. People learned again that the first defense of a household was a household's own wisdom and vigilance. As the decades passed, the Meeks Massacre also took on a broader symbolic role in the Ozark region's understanding of outsiders and movement. The crime hinged on a journey, on a wagon leaving home at night with men who offered a road to safety. In the 20th century, the Ozarks faced accelerating change, with more roads, more rail, more migration, and more strangers passing through. Old stories about dangerous roads became even more potent under that pressure. The Meeks tale fed the uneasiness many rural families felt as the world grew faster and less knowable. It became part of the region's cautionary archive about travel, trust, and the risk of letting desperation steer you into another man's hands. In community memory, the Meeks story also reinforced a sense of spiritual moral order, even among those who were not overtly pious. The ballad and the retellings frame the crime as a sin that demanded reckoning, because that is how Ozark culture makes tragedy bearable. If the world is only chaos, then suffering is intolerable. If the world is moral weather, then suffering is still painful but not meaningless. The hanging of William Taylor became more than punishment. It became proof that moral order had not entirely collapsed. Even the uncertainty around George Taylor was folded into this spiritual frame, as a reminder that judgment may not always come in this life, but that nothing truly disappears from the eyes of God or the memory of the hills. And of course, the Meeks Massacre influenced Ozark culture by becoming part of its artistic memory. Beyond the ballads, the story appeared in local lore collections, in recollections traded at reunions, in the kind of back porch conversations where older folks lean back and say, "Do you mind the Meeks affair?" And younger ones nod, not because they lived it, but because they inherited it. These moments are how a region quietly curates its identity. The Ozarks is not built only from geography. It is built from remembered trials and the lessons drawn from them. Yet for all this influence, the story never became a neat moral plaque. It remained uneasy. It left people with a lingering question about the limits of knowledge and the presence of evil in ordinary life. That uneasiness is part of why the tale stayed alive. A fully solved story tends to settle. A story that still feels a little open will keep breathing in the mouths of those who tell it. So when we look back from our own distance now, we see the Meeks family massacre as both a specific event in May of 1894 and as a long shadow across Ozark cultural ground. It taught caution without killing hospitality. It renewed respect for law without erasing self-reliance. It hardened a region's awareness of betrayal while also lifting up the stubborn dignity of survival. And it turned a single family's suffering into a shared memory that helped the Ozarks and its fringe counties define what they feared, what they valued, and what they believed about the moral shape of the world. The old ballad does not say all that outright. It does not have to. Its work is quieter. It ends with images, not arguments. A field in the dawn, a child walking home, a rope in the wind. Those images have traveled a long way through more than a century of Ozark listening, and each time they travel, they ask the same soft question. What kind of land are we living in, and what kind of people must we be to live in it without losing our souls? And as that question hangs there, like mist above a creek at sunrise, we come to the last stretch of our trail, a place where the story does not end with certainty, but with the way memory itself settles into the hills, leaving us with truth, with legend, and with the quiet space between them that the Ozarks has always known how to inhabit. That quiet space between truth and legend is where most old Ozark stories finally lay down, not because they are solved, but because they have been lived with long enough to become part of the ground. The Meeks family massacre is one of those stories. It began as a set of hard facts in May of 1894, in a field near Jenkins Cemetery, with straw pulled over bodies and a wounded child walking home through dawn. It moved through courtrooms, through a hanging, through rumors that never quite shut their mouths. Then it moved into song, and after song, into the deep, slow memory that a region carries the way an old tree carries lightning scars, not by forgetting, but by growing around what hurt it. When you stand at a distance of more than a century, the temptation is to want a final statement, to say this was the reason, this was the lesson, and now the case is closed. But there are two problems with that kind of ending. The first is simple honesty. We do not know everything. The record gives us much, but it does not give us the exact breadth of that night. The private thoughts of Gus and Delora as they climbed into the wagon, the last small sounds Hattie and Mary made before the field went quiet. We do not know whether a brother named George truly faced justice or dissolved into another life across the hills. We do not know how Nellie slept in the years after, whether she ever found a way to remember her family without drowning in the memory of their deaths, whether she felt the ballad as comfort or as a weight. Those gaps are not failures. They are the natural limits of any human attempt to look backward. The second problem is deeper. Even if we did know every detail, a story like this does not end the way a ledger ends. It does not come to rest because all the numbers add up. It comes to rest only when people have carried it long enough that it settles into their sense of the world. That is what happened here. The Meeks tragedy stopped being only an event and became a kind of moral weather in the Ozark fringe. It taught caution. It sharpened the boundary between trust and naivety. It reminded a rural people that evil can ride in on a friendly voice. But it also, quietly, reminded them that survival is possible in the very place where love is taken. Nellie's small footsteps through dawn, whatever else they meant that the night did not own the last word. If you listen to the ballad in your mind, you can hear how the region wanted to hold that balance. The song does not only mourn, it warns. It does not only condemn, it remembers. The older Ozark tradition of murder songs is not a taste for gore. It is a way of refusing silence when silence feels like surrender. A community that sings of its tragedies is doing two things at once. It is admitting the dark is real, and it is saying the dark will not erase the names of the dead. The Meeks ballad kept Gus, Delora, Hattie, and Mary from slipping into an unmarked past. Whatever else the song has drifted into, that act of remembrance is a kind of justice the courthouse alone could never give. Yet there is still something uneasy at the heart of all remembrance by song. A ballad can honor, but it can also simplify. It can turn a household into symbols, a mother into a saint, a father into a martyr, the killers into pure devils with no human edges. That simplification helps listeners feel safe. If evil is only monstrous, we can imagine it fenced off from ourselves. But the hard Ozark truth is that evil is not always monstrous. Sometimes it has a familiar face, a hand you have shaken, a voice you have trusted on your own porch. The Meeks story endures partly because it will not let us forget that. It asks, in its quiet way, how well we really know the hearts we travel with. And so we are left, as the region was left, with a braid instead of a straight line. There is truth in the court record, firm and terrible. There is legend in the songs and whisperings, drifting and human. And between them is the lived reality of a people who had to keep planting corn and raising children on the same roads where betrayal had once rolled by under moonlight. The Ozarks does not demand that all stories be neat. It demands that they be carried with respect. If you were to walk out near the old fields today, you would not find straw stacks. You might not even find the same fence lines. Land changes hands, roads shift, and the prairie swallows traces the way it always has. You might stand by Jenkins Cemetery and hear only wind and grass. Maybe the far sound of a truck now instead of a wagon then. Yet the place is still there in another sense. It exists in community memory, in a ballad that can still be found in fragments, in old families who say the Meeks name with a pause afterward. The land holds what people tell about it, and the people tell what the land has held. I think often, when stories reach this point, about the small, quiet fact that most of us live our whole lives without knowing how close we may be to someone else's darkness. Gus Meeks likely thought he was choosing the lesser danger when he agreed to leave with the Taylors. Delora likely trusted her husband's judgment because that is what spouses do when life is already hard. The children likely believed the road was leading them somewhere safe, because children are built to believe their parents' hands know the way. The killers likely saw themselves as cornered men doing what cornered men must. None of that excuses them. But it does remind us that tragedy is often born not from a single thunderclap, but from a chain of human choices that each felt, in the moment, like a way out. Maybe that is why the story stays. Not to frighten for fright's sake, but to keep us awake to the fragileness of our own ordinary days, to the way trust is both necessary and risky, to the way desperation can make a road look like salvation when it is actually a trap, and to the stubborn, mysterious gift of survival that sometimes appears where no one expects it. In the end, what can we say with certainty? We can say a family was taken in the dark and destroyed. We can say a child lived and carried the truth home. We can say one killer faced the rope and another perhaps did not. We can say the Ozarks and its borderlands turned the pain into song, and the song into memory, and the memory into a lesson that still breathes between the ridges. But beyond that, there is a space we should not fill too quickly. A space where their lives were more than their deaths, where Nellie's future was more than her survival, where the hills hold sorrow without fully explaining it. The Ozarks has always known how to leave that space. It does not rush to close every door. It lets some doors stay half open, because half-open doors are where reflection lives. So tonight, as you sit listening, maybe in a warm room with the year's wind outside your own windows, let the last image stand without forcing it into a tidy meaning. A field at dawn, quiet as breath, straw shifting softly in a breeze, a small girl walking toward the first house she can see, not knowing she is carrying a song the region will sing for generations, and behind her, the road that brought her there, fading into morning light, still asking that old question the Ozarks never answers all the way. What do we owe the dead, And what do we owe the living when the dark has passed through and left us to keep going?